I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Stacey Walsh from Oxford Information Labs. Today we have published a paper on the landscape of regulation internationally. This is free to download from our website. Stacey is the lead author. What I can say is she's been an absolute delight to work with. So I'm pleased that she's going to come and talk about the work that she's been involved in.
Thank you very much, John. So yes, I am one of the authors of the Regulation Ready report that we've put out today. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story, and the story of what we found when we went through and we looked at 5 regions. So we did the EU, US, UK, Australia, and Singapore. And we looked at 3 regulations or policies in each region. So we looked at 15 total regulations. So there was a lot of reading, a lot of coding, what was in those policies. And a quick overview of what we found is that there's no overarching national or regional IoT regulation yet. We all know that it's coming down the line because we know that governments are working on it, and they're working on them. Today, you see in California, there's been a cybersecurity, an IoT security regulation that's been voted on, but it hasn't enacted yet. That will be in 2020. So it's coming down the line. What we see what's happening right now is that governments are applying existing regulation to the IoT. So there's no specific regulation, but you're already on the hook for something, whether it's competition or child protection. So when we were doing this research, we asked some really fundamental questions when we were reading through the regulations. First off, if there's no specific policy to IoT, is what's out there, is it fit for purpose? Is it applicable to what we have today? If it's not applicable, can it be easily updated to reinforce how it affects the IoT? If that's not possible, what might a new IoT regulation look like? What would we expect there to be in there? What would we expect to be in there? And then finally, and this is really what we're getting at, how does this overlap with security? It's that security mindset that John was talking about. How do we really buoy security in IoT? So focusing on the security side for a moment, what do we want from a more secure IoT? One is that we want to harness the opportunities that it provides. It might be time savings, financial savings, better health, more efficient processing or manufacturing. We're not quite sure what that is for each individual, but we want to harness those opportunities. We also want to encourage adoption and deployment, but we also want the right kind of adoption. We don't want a lot of unsecure devices in the ecosystem that is just going to cause a plethora of DDoS attacks, or to have your smart home go offline and you can't get in your front door. So we want that right kind of adoption. And if we look at security, we're looking at protecting a few different things. We want to protect citizens and users. We want to protect the marketplace, and that includes competition, to have fair and genuine competition in the marketplace. And we want to protect from cyber incidents, and that's the more standard view of cybersecurity, right? So protecting networks and devices and the impact from cyber physical systems. So what we're getting at here is that security is not one thing. Security is everything from health and safety of the users up to national security. This is a lot to take in. It also means that there's a lot of regulation that can be applied. And keeping this in mind, I know we've all heard this before, but security is not a destination, it's a journey. It's an iterative process. So when we're looking at these regulations and we're looking at what's coming down the pipe, we need to keep that in mind as well. So in terms of what's out there, what's being applied to the IoT today? Well, we found 2 basic categories of regulations. One is what I would call a traditional regulation, things that have been out for a long time. This is consumer protection, competition. Child protection is a big one because that's the lowest barrier to entry in terms of regulating the IoT. And of course, telecommunications. We've seen that with the My Friend Kayla doll in Germany. Others are more recent or more modern policies, things like data protection, cybersecurity, and then public-private partnerships, something like the CISA Act in the US, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. That was an interesting regulation to look at because it was a very positive regulation. Instead of having sanctions, you had relief from legal liabilities if you participated. So that was an interesting approach to try and have companies think about the security mindset. So going into an example, I'll look at the UK and Australia quickly here. So in the UK, the Consumer Rights Act has a part about digital content being fit for purpose. In that sense, we looked at what we have on the right side here, and these are what we considered security-minded treatments that would help with compliance with these regulations. So we considered traffic monitoring or blocking a possible compliance activity for the Consumer Rights Act, because you were protecting the data, you were protecting the traffic over the networks, and you were protecting the traffic that's also flowing down into the consumer devices. And that's where our software and firmware patch come in. If you are managing a device that is in a consumer's home, if you can update that software and firmware, you are also protecting that digital content that's flowing in the ecosystem. In terms of the Privacy Act in Australia, there was a lot of discussion about what happens when you go extraterritorially with data, similar to GDPR, right? So if data is flowing outside of Australia, how does it impact that IoT provider in Australia? Well, it became clear to me that contracts and requirements between third parties and the local provider were extremely important. Because if something went wrong with that third-party provider, it was the local IoT provider that was on the hook for a risk assessment and notification to the local authorities. So knowing who's responsible for what, knowing who's implementing what type of security mechanisms becomes extremely important. So if we take that brief overview, considering the UK and Australia, we can see that our security-minded strategies could be broken down into two basic categories. One I would call an organizational category, and the other more of a technical category. Organizational categories I consider something like policies, so data protection policy or disclosure policy if something goes wrong. I would also consider something like security by design frameworks being implemented. There were a number of regulations that are not only interested in what product is on the market, but it's interested in how the product was designed, how the product was manufactured, and what the product is that's on the market. So implementing a security by design framework, having that mindset from the outset, can help with your compliance activities. And having that framework set up, it also provides a piece of paper that you can show, right? And then lastly, risk assessments. That could be a risk assessment for the organization itself, but it could also be a data protection impact assessment, something that GDPR is supporting, that the European Commission has put out a framework for. In terms of the technical sides, there were a few things that really kind of were repeated for me in terms of good compliance activities. One is internationally recognized standards. The other is certification and conformity assessment, which we'll talk about a bit later. And a really important one is the product lifecycle management. This fits with things like security by design, but it also fits with issues like updating and patching, or making sure that a device could be factory reset or taken offline appropriately. So what happens if you don't comply? What if you're found there's non-compliance? Uh-oh. Well, fines, first of all. But this isn't just fines. This could also be compensation for damages, which can escalate fines very quickly. We have personal liability. So this is for if you are a CEO or a high-level manager, you might be on the hook for some of these compliance activities, and that could be a fine or imprisonment. Cease and desist orders, erasure of data, public announcements and product recalls, and then binding instructions on security features. And I'll go a bit more into detail with some of these in a moment. If we're taking a closer look at the fines, we know that GDPR has the largest fines at the moment. But then if we look at the Federal Trade Commission in the US, it's over $40,000 per violation per day. So if you're found to be in violation for 3 violations, that's $120,000 per day. That's a lot. That adds up quickly. Then if you look at Australia and Singapore down at the bottom, they've split out their fines for individuals and for corporations. So Australia, your maximum fine as an individual is 420,000 Australian dollars, and in For the corporation, it's $2.1 million. So on to examples. I think most of us know my friend Kayla. That was interesting because it used a telecommunications law and a surveillance provision in there. In the US, I'm going to pull out an ASUS and Vizio example. So ASUS, the home routers and cloud services were found to be not only falsely advertising secure devices, but also implementing poor security practices. As a result, FTC required them to maintain a comprehensive security program. Now, I haven't seen a regulator mandate certain security treatments specifically, such as encryption, something like that yet, but this is going down that line. Because if you look at the next line, ASUS is also subject to 20 years of audits. So if one of those third-party audits is found that they are not having a comprehensive security program, I wouldn't be surprised if the FTC came around and said, okay, now you have to do X, Y, Z, and be very specific about what type of security treatments they need to implement. For Vizio, the smart television issue had to do more with data. It was collection of personal data that consumers actually had no idea was being collected. So it resulted in a $2.2 million settlement, which is a good amount of money, but also they had to delete all of the data they collected before March 2016. So for companies that are really relying on data for a business model, this could be a significant impact to your company. Looking ahead, so that's what's happening now in terms of regulation being applied to IoT. Well, governments see that the market has not self-regulated, and I mean that in terms of security specifically. It's not up to snuff for a lot of governments. So they want to encourage that security-minded products in the marketplace and adoption of those products by consumers. Some people have noted that there are some moves to reduce regulation on IoT. But really, this is more about removing barriers to deployment or adoption versus adding more regulation in a security mindset to try and encourage the right type of adoption. So what do we think is coming down the line? In the EU, US, and UK, there are policies or regulations that are currently being developed or have recently been voted on. And in Australia and Singapore, there's no indication of regulation yet, but in Australia, there are reports that the government is looking at a consumer rating system, something similar to the energy rating system that we have here. And I think this is interesting because that focuses on consumer education and awareness, something that the other three acts that I've noted at the top don't address. Although the US does have the TIPS Act, which is going down that line as well. In Singapore, there's no noted regulation yet. Their plan is to not regulate until they see the open international standards. That's what they're focusing on. They're focusing on developing and open international standards and what that means in terms of good practice for security. That might mean that there's regulation coming down the pipe, but they've not given any indication yet. So, if we're going to have a new regulation, or if we're going to update existing regulations, what would we expect to see in that, based on what I've seen in my research? First off is product lifecycle support. I've seen this in a number of current regulations where this could really be hammered home for IoT, but then also in the UK Code of Practice for consumer IoT. This is part of their really trying to make a baseline security across the IoT ecosystem. This also supports consumer rights in terms of how long does a product have to be functioning? How long do you need to support that product before you can say, okay, it's up to the consumer? Government procurement. So this is an example from the US. The Cybersecurity Improvement Act is really focusing at government procurement of IoT devices. And what they would like to see is have that then foster good security in devices and have that move into the consumer market. The US has done this before with other types of regulation, and so it's not really surprising that they're giving this a try before they do hard regulation. Product design. This goes into the secure or privacy by design frameworks. And we see this a lot with the CE mark and GDPR in the EU. So it's that idea that security is really from conception to deployment, and then after that, it's that iterative process. Another thing to think about here is that you could see, especially with GDPR, there's an increased liability for third parties. So manufacturers and other, could be a data processor even. If you are helping to develop a system, decide how to collect data, how to process data, or how that system will be used in the end, you might be just as liable to these regulations as the IoT provider themselves, because you're helping to develop that product. And then lastly, certification and conformance testing, which I think we'll have a whole session to talk about in a minute. So Australia Competition and Consumer Act really hits home about how approved certification can be used for compliance activities. And that is part of that due diligence that's really important here. So what can you do now? Very quickly, security mindset, definitely, to prepare for changes to regulations or upcoming regulation. These activities can help you prove your regulatory compliance, demonstrate due diligence, as well as duty of care. Because, as we said, IoT security can be everything from health and safety all the way up to national security. And then finally, that long-term life cycle management. It's from beginning to the time when the device takes its last breath. Governments are helping, though. So governments are putting out stepping stones for companies to take on board when they are developing or updating their products. So there is a range of guidance put out, and we found guidance from every single jurisdiction that we looked at in this research. That includes even Singapore, which Singapore, as you know, is a very light touch regulation country, but they have guidance for IoT security for Smart Nation. So if you're looking to move a product to market, it's not only good to look at what type of guidance has been put out in that market specifically, but look at what's been put out elsewhere to see where those good practices or best practices are and how you can move to new markets. So for example, one compliance activity is conformance testing. And the IoTSF security compliance framework has been out for a while now. And it was found in a recent study to be the most aligned framework with the UK's Code of Practice on Consumer IoT Security. In total, there are 159 recommendations that mapped from the security compliance framework to the Code of Practice. Now let's take a moment to think about this. So the Code of Practice is based on the Secure by Design report. The Secure by Design report is currently, or the subset of it, is currently at ETSI being standardized. So very soon we will have a standard that is very closely related to the IoTSF security compliance framework. And then that leads a logical path down to a conformance framework or assessment. So I would say stay tuned, watch this space to see what's happening. Thank you.